Alrighty everyone, so in this video I'm going to continue to review and supplement some of the concepts that were featured in Chapter 1 or Module A, which provides an introduction to cognitive psychology. And in this particular video, I'm going to continue our discussion of the decline of behaviorism, or how the view that psychological science should only focus on observable behavior and not give any reference to the mind or mental processes, why that view fell out of favor. Okay, so we're going to talk about another nail in the proverbial coffin of the behaviorist movement. And that was a controversy, or the controversy, over language acquisition. Okay, so on the behaviorist side of this argument, we have B.F. Skinner, who, like John B. Watson, again held the view that everything is learned or a product of the environment, and the way that we learn is simply by creating associations either between different stimuli, as in classical conditioning, or between a particular behavioral response and the resultant outcome, as in operant conditioning. So what was being debated here was the question of how humans acquire language, right? So how does language come to be, or how does it develop? And so the behaviorist account that originated with Skinner was simply that language is a product of operant conditioning, right? So children just automatically sort of imitate what they hear from their parents, and eventually, just at random, they stumble upon the correct pronunciation, right? So you might imagine maybe an infant, a 6-month-old infant, just randomly is creating noises, and all of a sudden they happen upon mama, right? So what happens the first time a baby says mama? Well, there's a tremendously rewarding or positive response, right? Or again, rewarding response. So automatically the mother is just overcome. She claps her hands and says, "Oh, I'm so proud of you. I can't believe this. I love you so much." Maybe she whips out her phone and starts videoing for her Instagram account, right? So there's a very obvious and very immediate reward, right? In the form of praise from the parents, right? So eventually the child associates these seemingly random noises with the response of praise, and as a result of that rewarding outcome, they continue to make those sounds, right? So Skinner argues that that is literally how we acquire our entire vocabulary, right? It's just at random, we imitate the speech that we hear, and the correct speech is rewarded. And so every word that we know in our vocabulary is the result of random utterance followed by reward. And in the sort of cognitive or non-behaviorist camp, we have Noam Chomsky, who argued that language learning is the result of what he called an innate language acquisition device. So an innate language acquisition device is simply an inborn biological program, right? Or a feature of our cognitive architecture that predisposes us to be able to learn language, right? So we all come into the world with minds that have a specific mechanism, a cognitive or mentalistic mechanism that allows us to learn language, or it predisposes us to understand language, right? And so one of the primary arguments in this camp, or with this idea of the innate language acquisition device, was just like you guys saw in the preceding video, right? The idea of universal grammar. So one of the pieces of evidence that Chomsky used to support his theory of the innate language acquisition device was the idea that there is a universal grammar, right? So it's the idea that all languages of the world, right, regardless of geographic location, regardless of the nature of the language itself, all world languages have the same core features in common, right? So all languages, like you guys saw in the video, have some way of affirming or denying something, or saying yes or no. All human languages have something resembling a noun and something resembling a verb, and so on, right? So even though world languages are all very, very different, right, they all seem to abide by the same underlying structure, right? And when we come into the world, we are predisposed with an innate understanding of that structure, right? So really all we have to do is compare the sounds that we hear to that inborn biological program, or that sort of innate structure that we're predisposed to already understand. And that allows us to learn language, right? So we compare the sounds we hear to this inborn biological program, and that's how we learn language. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about different kinds of evidence, or different examples of evidence that seems to uniquely go against Skinner's behaviorist account in support Chomsky's cognitive account, or the account of the innate language acquisition device and universal grammar. Okay, so one of the primary pieces of evidence that seems to uniquely support Chomsky's account is that all language seems to be learned in a universal sequence, right? So regardless of the particular language that you speak, it seems to proceed in the same 3 stages, right? So all human language development begins with what's known as cooing, right? So cooing around the age of 3 months is basically just a production of vowel-like sounds by infants, often repeated in a joyful manner, right? So ooh, ah, and so on, just in a very, you guys have all heard cooing, right? So it's just the random production of vowel sounds, usually in kind of a joyful manner, right? And then around 4 or 5 months, babies start the babbling stage, and that is when they combine consonants with vowels, right? So this is where you see goo goo, gaga, mama, dada, and so on. And the last phase around the age of 18 months is what's called telegraphic speech. So those of you who don't know, there used to be things called telegrams, which were basically messages communicated kind of door to door so a person would come to your door and give you a very urgent message, but it was always very, very short. So it was expensive to order a telegram, so you would keep your message as short as possible, right? So telegraphic speech is just 2-word phrases typically used by infants around the age of 18 months to convey some kind of desire, typically. So they might say, cookie gone, which means, give me another cookie, or pick up, which means pick me up, and so on, right? And eventually telegraphic speech gives way to completely fluent sentences, right? But the important thing is that, again, all of this occurs in a universal sequence regardless of the language spoken by the child. Okay. Another piece of evidence that seems to support the idea that we're predisposed to learn language is infant-directed speech. Okay, so infant-directed speech used to be called motherese, and it's basically just baby talk, right? So all of us, whenever we see an infant, right, suddenly our speech changes, and it's usually beyond our control. Right? So how do you typically talk to an infant, or even a puppy, or something that you deem to be especially cute, right? Well, there's a characteristic style of speech, and again, it's almost beyond your control, like you just can't help yourself, right? So when we talk to infants or puppies, we often speak in a much higher tone. We often repeat ourselves. And most importantly, we very, very carefully enunciate our speech. So one could argue that the reason why we have this automatic desire to speak to infants using this particular style of speech is that we're changing our speech in an effort to make it easier for them to learn it, right? So by repeating ourselves and carefully enunciating our words and adopting a very happy, encouraging tone, we're sort of directly facilitating language acquisition. Again, so this is evidence that we're predisposed to both learn and teach language to young infants. Okay, so we've talked about the universal stages of language acquisition. We've talked about infant-directed speech. We've talked about novel utterances and overcorrection errors. And lastly, the last two pieces of evidence that we're going to explore are the vocabulary explosion and the universal need to communicate with language. Okay, so what is the vocabulary explosion? Well, typically around the second year of life, the rate at which a child learns new words begins to increase dramatically, right? And that should have been evident to you if you've ever had the pleasure of spending any time with a 2-year-old. You'll note that anytime you take them anywhere, if you're carrying them around in a store or whatever, one of the most common things that they like to do is point to something and say, "What's that?" Right? So around 2 years of age, they're really, really invested in learning the names for things, pretty much anything they can think of, and they're really invested in expanding their vocabulary. So this is the vocabulary explosion. And what's interesting to that is that infants come into the world knowing 0 vocabulary words, obviously, but around the age of 5 or 6 years old, most children are completely fluent in their native language, even though they're not as their vocabulary obviously isn't as expansive as that of an adult, right? So what that suggests, right, is that children learn language far too quickly or at far too fast of a rate in order for them to have learned through reinforcement alone, right? There's this dramatic uptick in words that they know that proceeds far quicker than we would expect through reinforcement alone. Right, and so the last piece of evidence that kind of goes against Skinner's operant conditioning account is if we look at populations primarily in developing countries that don't have good resources for individuals with hearing impairments, right? So as you guys saw in the video with Susan Golden Meadow, right, psychologists and linguists who have worked with these populations find that children who don't have access to American Sign Language or don't have access to speech pathologists to teach them ASL, their desire or their innate need to communicate is so powerful that when deaf children find themselves in an environment where nobody uses sign language, they invent a sign language for themselves, right? So that universal need to communicate through language is so strong that if there is no existing language present, we have the ability to create it ourselves. And the home languages that these children create are very, very complex and very effective communicative tools, right? So again, what that collectively suggests is that we are all endowed with both the ability to learn language in usual circumstances, as well as circumstances where there is a language or an existing language structure that's absent, right? The other thing to note about language among those who are deaf or hearing impaired is that even deaf children show those universal stages of language development. So deaf children go through, for example, cooing and babbling and telegraphic speech, except that instead of using spoken speech, they're using various forms of sign, right? Okay, so that concludes our discussion of the controversy of language acquisition and how that contributed to the decline of behaviorism. Okay, all right, so I'll continue this discussion in our next video.